We are delighted to begin this day with a keynote from Admiral Michelle Howard, who's going to speak on NATO as a model for multilateral cooperation. But just as a brief introduction, although she's spoken yesterday and you are familiar with her, I don't know how many of you have watched the movie Captain Phillips. Captain Phillip, that movie was inspired, or rather was a part of her theater of action. It was under her command in Africa that the whole incident around the hijacking and the rescue took place. I'm sure the real one was even more exciting, and the movie could not capture all the nuance. But may I request Michelle Howard to speak to us this morning.
Good morning. And I'd like to again thank ORF for inviting me to speak at this prestigious conference. So I'd like to start by acknowledging my host today and by briefly using the iconic Taj Mahal as a metaphor. So there are several fascinating stories about this building, but one of the most intriguing is that it was constructed using materials from across India and Asia, with over 1,000 elephants being used to transport construction items. The white marble came from Makrana, the jasper from Punjab with jade and crystal from China. The turquoise is from Tibet, and the lapis from Afghanistan. The sapphire is from Sri Lanka, and the carnelian is from Arabia. In all, some 28 types of precious and semi-precious stones from across this part of the world are inlaid in this magnificent building, making it a modern wonder. And it is obvious why Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore described it as the teardrop on the cheek of time. Now, coincidentally for me, 28 also happens to be the current number of nations represented in NATO. In 1990, Robert Keynote, professor of political science at Princeton University, defined multilateralism as the practice of coordinating national policies in groups of 3 or more states. So by this definition, 28 is reasonable to suggest we at NATO more than qualify as a multilateral actor. Indeed, some future poet of peace may refer to it as a modern multinational world wonder. And although a youngster compared to the Taj Mahal, NATO has been around for nearly 70 years, which is something to say about its relevance in a multilateral, multipolar world. And today I would like to talk to you about what I believe NATO does that has let it thrive as a multilateral organization for these 7 decades, a period of time in which there have been several new normals. And I hope to share some personal insight as a NATO operational commander and to introduce some themes which I believe have allowed NATO to adapt and be germane now as when it was first conceived. And to use the Taj Mahal still as an analogy, how NATO brings together 28 precious gems to create an iconic structure that lasts for generations. So what is NATO? It is certainly one of the most ubiquitous acronyms in the world. Indeed, if you ask Google what is an acronym, it returns to NATO as an example. It's one of those acronyms that has become so commonplace in language that I believe it is easy to lose sight of what the alliance means and what it stands for. So I'd like to go back to the beginning of the North Atlantic Treaty, a treaty signed in Washington, D.C. on 4 April 1949 by the 12 founding members, just 4 years after the inception of the Charter of the United Nations. And this is significant, as the Charter of the United Nations is at the heart of NATO's ethos. The opening paragraphs of the North Atlantic Treaty say that the parties reaffirm their faith in the purposes and principle of the Charter of the United Nations and their desire to live in peace with all peoples and all governments. They are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And they seek to promote stability and well-being in the North Atlantic area. So consider that last sentence, promoting stability and well-being within the North Atlantic area. NATO really is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Its focus is dedicated to promoting the area, principally Europe and North America, who have a vested interest within the scope of this body of water. And may I propose an idea to you? This vested interest in a shared body of water is a unique bond between NATO's member states. And perhaps as a naval officer, and it might be slightly parochial of me to suggest, consider that this body of water across which NATO members share ideas, trade, and people, that's what makes it important. So collective defense includes the people and cargo who flow across the Atlantic Ocean. Enshrined within the spirit of the original North Atlantic Treaty, so eloquently articulated with the words common heritage, the Atlantic Bond has been significant to European and American history. It is an important link that has shaped world history. However, it would be myopic to suggest it is the only link around the world. This map shows global shipping density at about approximately 2013. It actually only illustrates vessels that exceed 300 tons that are engaged in international commercial services. It paints a very clear picture of the global links which bind all of us together. You see, the links on this map represent more than shipping lanes. They represent the flow of cargo, people, or energy. And much in the same way that precious gems and stones flowed to a nexus point that was the Taj Mahal, today is the same when you look at these areas of concentration on this visual. Moreover, these established trade routes are analogous to the routes upon which the backbone of the internet flow. The transit routes of global fiber mirror the shortest routes between major population centers around the globe. They can also represent the flow of ideas, good or bad, between nations. Indeed, they might represent the ebb and flow of global society. So in essence, this visual shows us more than shipping lanes. It's a visual representation of bonds across the globe. And with this perspective, I invite you to use it as a lens as I continue to talk about the multipolar world we are moving toward. So when you look about that red and yellow across the Atlantic, that represents NATO. The very existence of these shipping links is testament to the stability and well-being which NATO has striven for over the last 70 years. Put simply, the North Atlantic must be stable for traffic to move safely. The simplicity of the treaty has weathered the test of time. It is remarkable that on Article 5, an attack against one is an attack against all, has only been invoked once within NATO's history, following the September 11th attacks in the United States. And the aftermath of 9/11 is perhaps prophetic of the new normal in which we live today. NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Pug Ismay, said the following about the founding of NATO. "I am convinced that the present solution is only a partial one, aimed at guarding the heart. It must grow until the whole free world gets under one umbrella." This quote was incredibly prescient and encapsulates many of the principles that have shaped NATO. It implies an impermanence with the status quo, that NATO would continue to grow and safeguard democratic freedom, ably manifested within NATO's commitment to combine transparent dialogue with defense across a range of partners and the creation of an open-door policy towards membership. From the 12 initial founding members, we now have 28 states across North America and Europe, and the newest, Albania and Croatia, joined in April 2009. And this coming summer, we expect the 29th, Montenegro, to finalize a session. An additional 22 countries participate in NATO's Partnership for Peace program, with other countries involved in partnership frameworks, such as the Mediterranean Dialogue, the Istanbul Cooperative Initiative, and our global partnerships with Pacific nations such as Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand. Meanwhile, the concept of one umbrella is the perfect analogy for collective defense to include deterrence. The unity has driven principles of interoperability and common procedures, and I find it fascinating that NATO pioneered standards that are ubiquitous, both within and out of the military community, such as a phonetic alphabet and a common system of aircraft so that allied aircraft could use other nations' bases. Today, NATO has proven systems and processes for interoperability tested with real-world experience. We continue to develop and enhance our efforts to work together. This interoperability has been born out of years of NATO's cooperation in a bipolar world. Article 5 is familiar, but there's also an Article 4, which any ally can raise when they feel that their territorial integrity, political independence, or security of their country is threatened. Article 4 has been invoked 5 times in NATO's history. In 2003 by Turkey as a precursor to the Gulf War, and multiple times later due to the Syrian crisis by Latvia, Poland, and Lithuania in response to the Crimean crisis. During the bipolar era, the normal was maintained by NATO's collective resolve to deter an adversary from threatening the territorial integrity of its members. This era presupposed conflict that was state on state with state actors, and NATO's collective defense was built on this model. However, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, heralding the beginning of a new era, NATO had to adapt if it was to continue to influence across an evolving political environment. And during the Washington Summit in April 1999, 50 years after the alliance's inception, NATO recognized it would have to change its strategic concept to become more proactive. NATO had to contribute to conflict prevention and to engage actively in crisis management, including crisis response operations. A landmark event in this shift in alliance thinking was NATO's intervention in Kosovo in '99. The mission is based on the UN Security Council resolution that calls for a secure environment where refugees and displaced people can return home, the international civil presence could operate, and a transnational administration was established, and humanitarian aid could be delivered. The Kosovo force of KFOR is still active today, providing a safe and secure environment. It's smaller than it was, as it should be, but it's still at 4,500 troops across the ground in Kosovo. And these military members are drawn from across 30 contributing nations. Perhaps most significantly, it includes partners as well as allies working in a totally integrated fashion. And I would argue that one of KFOR's greatest strengths is its ability to form tailored teams which play to national strengths and capabilities. On an average day in Kosovo, you will find Italian police, the Carabinieri, conducting riot training with an Austrian helicopter overhead and a combined Portuguese and Hungarian company supporting, all of them backed up by a German medical facility. And these partnerships are symbolic of another major change within the alliance at the Washington Summit, which was the recognition of promoting wide-ranging partnership, cooperation, and dialogue with other countries in the Euro-Atlantic area. And the aims were to increase transparency and mutual confidence and capacity for joint action with the alliance. Particularly pertinent, in 1993, to be precise, was the same time that the treaty was signed that saw the European Union come into being. So it's worth talking about NATO's engagement with the EU for a few minutes, and it's absolutely at the heart of security within the Euro-Atlantic area. NATO and the EU can offer complementary capabilities to enact security across a spectrum, delivering safe and secure environments, along with capacity building and defense reform. By working in concert, both NATO and EU can better fulfill shared strategic objectives. For both organizations working together at all levels, conducting joint exercises, and practicing interoperability. That provides a tangible means to work multilaterally toward their respective aims. And I note the joint NATO-EU declaration announced at Warsaw in July of 2016, reaffirmed in December this last year, which gives new impetus and substance to EU-NATO cooperation in the areas such as countering hybrid threats, operational cooperation, including at sea, irregular migration, cybersecurity, and defense industry and research. And at the same time with the inception of EU, I believe something else significant within the global landscape was starting to take effect. During the 1980s, transatlantic and trans-Pacific trade, merchandise trade, from the Americas across the Atlantic Pacific was roughly equal to about $150 billion a year. And from that time frame, the 1980s, over the following 20 years, trans-Pacific trade grew faster than transatlantic, so that by the year 2000, trans-Pacific trade had grown to the point where it's worth $750 billion, while transatlantic trade was worth $500 billion. Today, transatlantic merchandise trade is worth $1 trillion, yet trans-Pacific is almost double at $1.9 trillion per year. And you could see that illustrated on the map when you look at those red lines and look at the volume of trade crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific, respectively. And the ramifications of this are shaping the nature of global connectivity today. It has shaped some of the heaviest traffic routes in the world, such as the Strait of Malacca. And it is no coincidence that we've seen several of these issues in the body of water in the Pacific, which NATO and EU have tackled much closer to Europe, such as mass migration and piracy. And consider the nexus point that is the Mediterranean for NATO. In 1994, NATO initiated our Mediterranean Dialogue, allowing the alliance to partner with 7 regional countries: Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Mauritania, Morocco, and Tunisia. And the Med Dialogue is aimed at contributing to regional security and stability, achieving enhanced mutual understanding, and dispelling misconceptions about the alliance with these key regional partners, entirely complementary with the aims of the NATO-EU integration. And for me, a promising and fruitful area for cooperation is NATO's engagement with the African Union, critical when you consider Africa's position with these global sea connections. Indeed, I can think of no better example of a multilateral effort which everyone held a stake in than the counter-piracy off of Horn of Africa. And piracy was not a new concept when the boats started to emerge from Somalia, taking crews captive and holding them for ransoms. Navies the world over have been dealing with piracies for centuries. However, this piracy, the impact was felt by many, and the solutions were regional. Modern-day anti-piracy efforts involved a coalition of partners to achieve our current status. No successful piracy attempts off the Somali coast in the past 3 years. The partners in this coalition included a combined maritime task force with voluntary contributions from 31 member nations, an operation from NATO, Ocean Shield, an operation from the EU, Operation Atlanta, and individual navies tasked by their governments to escort flagged vessels from their nations, and industry leaders willing to push for best practices aboard vessels in order to make them more difficult targets for potential piracy. And as mentioned, I had the good fortune of commanding CTF 151 in 2009, and the teamwork of everyone was remarkable. And the old adage of eating an elephant, and in my case a whale, one bite at a time, is true in an operating area which is encompassed by huge swath of waters: the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Somalia Ocean. Ships from all efforts were given specific areas in which to operate, information on weather and small boat activity was shared, and the AIS data of shipping vessels was analyzed to ensure proper coverage of commercial ships. So I see these forums for cooperation as a series of interconnecting or meshing networks. By identifying complementary capabilities and appropriate contact points, each of the organizations can fulfill objectives locally and benefit, but also contribute to the wider global network. Ultimately, this global network of meshed organizations is in all of our interest and serves to achieve a safer and more secure world. I've spoken a lot about what multilateralism has done, particularly in the case of NATO, but perhaps I should talk a little bit about what it should do. So whether by accident or design, whether or not there is a particular destination, we must recognize our direction of travel and the realization that standing multilateral organizations have a role to play in a multipolar world. The global interconnectivity behind me is fundamentally changing the role multilateral organizations may play, and it changes the speed at which they need to form a team and execute. The sea and landscape has evolved to include new challenges to our security systems. Take, for example, the rise of religious extremism or the threat of hybrid warfare. Those are risks to global security. And in addition, we all have the vulnerabilities of the cyber domain. All of these challenges could not have been anticipated at NATO's inception, but it's my firm belief that we can meet these challenges, and a reputable multinational organization such as NATO will perhaps be able to support other multilateral efforts to remedy these issues around the globe. Intolerance and religious extremism are global shared challenges. And if we are going to build tolerant societies, open societies that respect a multitude of religious beliefs, then we must be ever vigilant to the risks posed by extremism. And while conventional military tactics and training are less suitable for this threat, the sharing of intelligence and threat information is an area where NATO is extremely well versed, offers us a significant advantage within a multilateral construct, and we all benefit when all of us are fully cognizant of indicators and warnings that are observed by partners. Within the cyber domain, to respond to this threat, we will need new partnerships and working relationships that transcend traditional lines. Effective mitigation of a cyber threat could entail diplomatic engagement with a third-party country, negotiation with a commercial partner, or traditional application of military force. At the Warsaw Summit, NATO recognized cyberspace as a domain, and we'll have to be innovative to address the multiple issues associated with cyber. Interoperability, which NATO has previously done so well, offers a means to pass information, techniques and procedures between the military's governments and telecommunication companies to the benefit of sustaining a secure and trusted domain. And finally, with the hybrid threat, we see a graying of previous black lines. And we need to be aware that belligerence has now become a sliding scale rather than a definitive state. Warfare is a continuum rather than a binary on or off activity. Antagonists within this multipolar order will be able to change their approach at a speed which will be eye-opening to some. But whether our adversary attacks with a sword, a club, or the distributed denial of service attack, there is much NATO can do to resist. And the NATO force structure within allied countries and close engagement provides reassurance to our populations. Better still, such deep relationships provide NATO valuable windows into other ways of thinking and engaging. And NATO's close work with partner organizations within the Aegean Sea and Eastern Med provides new skills and complementary capabilities that will become decisive in mitigating hybrid threats. Open, transparent, and honest communications forms an essential pillar of this activity. It both reassures publics and deters potential adversaries. Hybrid threats are a global issue, and when you see the red on the diagram behind me, you see contested space. And where you see contested space, you will see this sliding scale of violence taking effect. Strong, respected multilateral institutions and transparent dialogue mitigate that red. So I talked to you at the start of the speech about the Taj Mahal and about the bringing together of a group of precious gems and minerals to form a masterpiece. And in its own way, NATO's greatest achievement in the last 70 years has been exactly that. We have incredible people in NATO from some very diverse backgrounds working together to achieve a common goal. And like the Taj Mahal, however, these gems form the basis of multilateralism, but the construction of an effective multilateral alliance requires more. Well-defined interoperability, honed and tested through rehearsal and rigorous exercises, means that when required, our international organization becomes unified in its objective. And that is why a strong multilateral organization has ensured peace and stability across and on one body of water, the Atlantic, for 70 years. What should be clear from the diagram behind me is that there is no doubt that India is a nexus point within this globalized, interconnected world as a nation which separates two bodies of water, the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. So I began this speech with a quote by Tagore, and I would like to finish with another one. You can't cross the sea merely by standing and staring at the water. So within this new normal and the normals to come, and from NATO, We know that the bodies of water have a significant aspect to multilateralism. We can choose to stand and stare at them, or we can cross them, meeting and making new partners, allies, and friends. Thank you.
We have time for, I think, a couple of questions. From the young fellows? So it's for the young fellows first. ICs? The mic.
It's on? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Admiral Howard, good morning. Thank you very much for your very fascinating presentation. I had a question regarding the relation between the EU and NATO in the future, because what we are witnessing right now is increased challenges in the security of Europe. So I'm a true believer of the fact that it might urge European nations to build maybe a stronger architecture of defense within the EU. And so I'm wondering, how do you see then in the future how NATO and an enhanced EU architecture working together? So you gave us some hints by talking about the declaration of 2016, but I would appreciate very much if you can elaborate a bit more on this issue. Thank you very much.
So let me start by some of the things that have happened now. Prior to this last July, at the tactical level, EU and NATO allied command organizations started very robust information sharing so that we could better synchronize our activities in the Mediterranean. And so then that led to agreements at the tactical level so that we could understand the information we're sharing and then synchronize those activities. Where we're moving to, and where some work we have done, is logistic support, a better understanding of what each other's operations are so that we are more efficient and effective in the use of military resources, and so that we prevent redundancy, but also deconflict activities within the Med. So one of the things that happened is this last summer, there's a shared deconfliction and awareness conference that's hosted by EU, but it's broader than EU. It's anyone who believes they have a stake in the migration problem in the Mediterranean. We hosted that conference at my headquarters at JFC Naples so that we could bring in the expertise of the NATO members, the contributing members who are also operating in the Med. In the future, we're going to have to get more robust in information sharing, logistic support, and then planning to counter the threats that are coming.
Can I request Christian? Sorry, Christian.
Good morning. I think it's a political question. So the incoming president's statements on the NATO have been rather reserved, I would say. In your opinion, what role will NATO play in President Trump's national security policy?
I can't comment on what the president's going to do.
Weber, I saw you jump up. Do you want to pose a question?
Thank you. My name is Vaibhav. I am a climate policy researcher and I am here in my capacity of Raisina Young Fellow. My question is, what role does NATO plays in managing the risk and conflicts due to extreme weather and climate change events?
I'm sorry, managing conflict and
Due to extreme weather and climate change.
climate change. So the climate change has not been at the forefront of the military portion. So NATO is a political military organization, vice a economic social organization. Within each of the nations, though, there is focus on energy sharing, and then and looking at different ways to manage energy in a more efficient way, to include, between my country and Italy, the use of biofuels for ships at sea. So it was climate change and then was?
And what about human assistance and disaster relief?
Oh my
due to
God, so,
climate-induced?
yes. So many of the standing organizations and missions within their mandates, humanitarian assistance is part of it. So the most recent was, for me, it was my team out in Kosovo. There was flooding in the Balkans, and they went right out to help clear roads and provide pathways for the people so that they could return to normalcy. But if there is an area and there's a mission nearby, then humanitarian assistance is normally authorized, and the commanders can move out quickly. Thank you.
So we'll go to Tamisha and then the gentleman there. Can we take two together?
Yes.
And then we'll close it. Tamisha.
Admiral Howard, thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. We all know that organized groups, terror groups, use the same shipping lanes that drug smugglers, people smugglers use. I'd be very curious to hear if NATO is doing any work on those kinds of issues. Thank you.
And the second question from the gentleman here, the final one for this morning. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Liu Zuyi from Shanghai Institute for International Studies. I would like to know that, as we know, the NATO is a product of Cold War. And after the end of the Cold War, NATO expanded Eastern large. So now there are a lot of new actors in the world and a lot of new challenges, not only state actors, but also non-state actors. Not only traditional security, but also non-traditional security. I think these security challenges need us to work together. So I would like to know, how can you make NATO inclusive? How can you make the global security architecture or regional security architecture inclusive? And who should make rules for this order? Thank you.
I think his question is that NATO is a Cold War organization. And is it time to lock the NATO doors and throw the keys and to create a new organization that reflects what we need today? I think that's what he's asking.
Okay. So in terms of does NATO manage the seas, and is there an understanding that the seas, that those flows can be for good and for evil? Yes. And so there's literally, at the same time that EU has been focused on the Med, NATO has been running a migration operation in the Aegean with contributing members anchored by the two members who have the greatest equity in that area, Turkey and Greece. And so at sea, we will form with the contributing members different task force to address different issues, which is, for example, how we got to, when you think about where NATO's home waters are, how NATO got to deploying a task force off of Somalia and manage that rotation for literally several years. In terms of state and non-state, I think NATO has recognized that there are non-state actors, and certainly any contributing member can provide intelligence on efforts that contribute to counterterrorism. Generally, the sovereign nations look at fighting terrorism within their own borders. And then NATO is already set up to share information and intelligence that helps support the nations maintain their sovereign territory, whether it's an incursion from a non-state actor or an actor. So whether or not someone starts up a new organization, you have to understand there are relationships and protocols and within a standing organization that can be leveraged. And I would say NATO has definitely, over time, remained remarkably adaptable. And to me, one of the biggest example is certainly when the Article 5 was called on behalf of the United States to reshape the entire training, manning and equipping of different militaries to fight in Afghanistan. Certainly shows an adaptability that should not be overlooked, because that is a very different fight in Afghanistan than the Cold War defense that we thought we would have to do.
Thank you, ma'am. So with that, let me thank you for your presentation and for engaging with us with some questions. Please join me in applauding Michelle Howard for her excellent presentation.
Thank you.